The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories.
Because it is not the government of the people any longer.
Circus ridiculous.
A new world order. A world where the rule of law governs the conduct of nations.
Most people do not understand the Illuminati.
It's all about control.
Conspiracy theories.
It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations.
A new world order.
Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised.
It's the Weekend Vigilante Show.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Weekend Vigilante Show. I'm your host, Sheila Zilinsky. The call-in number to our studios is 347-324-3704, and we may take some calls in the second segment of the program, but in the first hour, the one, the only, I always called him from the beginning, the instigator of the airwaves, joining us on the program. Everybody knows him from the very popular Common Sense show. Love his articles lately, Tim. My goodness. I didn't think Dave's articles could get any better, but welcome to the program, Dave.
Hi, Sheila. Glad to be with you.
You're being a trooper with being a little bit sick the last bit, so I know you got a bit of a scratchy throat, so we'll try to taper it to a minimum. But, wow, look at the headlines lately, Dave. I mean, where do we start with all this? I've got the Obama-Putin shuck and jive, and I love a comment that you made recently, and I wanted to kind of segue with this, but you really said that Putin is he's kind of in process of putting himself in charge of the world's chessboard, and he has developed this almost cult following amongst some of these alternative media groups, and he's kind of touted as representing a man with the force of conviction to go tell the international banking cartel to go to hell. And I really agree with this misguided analysis on these guys saying, he's achieved superhero status, some believing he's going to swoop in on the white horse and save the world from the evil banksters. But that's actually couldn't be further from the truth, could it, Dave?
No. People think that Putin is flying in the face of the bankers. They don't understand the nature of international banking. There are three essential levels. One is the big boys, the Bank of International Settlement, and that's where all roads end. They're the chief executor. They go by different names, and they're called different names for the secret societies that they've been alleged to be in, but they control the world's central banks, and that would be the Federal Reserve on the second level. And the central banks have been engaged in kind of a crony bullying kind of activities where they all gang up with the countries they control in their militaries, and they force nations like Iraq and Libya to capitulate. They murder nations' leaders who don't go along with the debt slavery of the central banking system controlled by the Bank of International Settlement. And then at the third level is Wall Street, and you got Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, and they're the grunt workers. They're the ones that carry out the policies on the ground. Here's what Putin has done. Putin has basically undermined the petrodollar, the only backing we have for the dollar, where the world has to go to our Federal Reserve, purchase dollars to buy energy. What Putin has done is encouraged Iran, and this goes back now almost 2 years, to sell its oil for gold, and this undermines the petrodollar in the Middle East. The BRIC nations are jumping all over this trend, and it's now expanded to nations like India and China. In Ukraine, here's where the crisis gets really interesting. In Ukraine, Sheila, we've got a unique situation. Russia supplies about a quarter to about 30% of our key NATO allies' gas energy needs.
You bet.
And Russia ships that gas through Ukraine. 2/3 of all that gas goes through the nation of Ukraine. And when Russia takes over Ukraine, and they will, because we do not have the military power to oppose them regionally at this point in time, not in that nation, they will be able to dictate energy policies. Putin could say to Europe, could say to Germany, yeah, we'll sell you gas at the same price, but we're not taking the dollar. We're taking the euro. And right then, the Federal Reserve is up a creek without a paddle. Now, how does this all play into the grand chessboard? Putin has outmaneuvered the central banks, particularly the ones in the West.
Yeah.
He is going to disrupt NATO because he's going to get Europe and their energy needs off of the dollar, and it's going to devastate our economy here in the United States. This is going to mean a war. If you're the Bank of International Settlement, you don't give a darn about your central banks. All you want is your new world order where you control everything. And if it takes a world war to do it, then so be it, and that's what we're going to get. The Bank of International Settlement is just sitting back and letting this happen, and then they're going to swoop in at the end of chaos following World War III and take control of everything.
Well, it reminds me of Americans. Let's face it, Americans have enjoyed that big dog status, the big economic dominance. And, it's very interesting. The world needed to purchase dollars from the Federal Reserve. Think of Bretton Woods. I think of all the things going on, as V talks about a lot. You've been in on those shows too, Dave, this sort of globally orchestrated financial meltdown. And it's become the task, really. But it really is right out of the New World Order playbook, isn't it?
Oh, it is. It's classic divide and conquer. These central banks are no more than a tool for the real supreme bankers that run this planet. I go back, Sheila, to when I was teaching an undergrad sociology course a couple years ago. Even the newer textbooks are keeping up with this trend, even if the American public. They're saying in one of these textbooks that I was using, they were saying in there that 50 men control the world's economy. I think that number is a little bit high. But even the textbook publishers are seeing it. But for some reason, our media won't talk about it, and most of Americans are totally ignorant to this fact.
Well, do you find it interesting that Putin, I think you articulated in the way of saying, he's checkmated the central banks. And it's really interesting. He is shifting toward the world, away from the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. Do you think he's kind of maneuvered? Does he really think that Russia stands a chance of having a gold-backed reserve currency? I would think China is doing that. But what are your thoughts on that?
I think that the big boys that run this planet economically are just giving him enough rope to carry out what they want done. What they want to do, number one, is take down the United States. Yep. And what we're seeing Putin do is surround the U.S. He's going to leave us isolated to where we'll either economically wither on the vine and not be a world power, or we'll be so weakened economically we can't muster a fight long enough to win a world war. And I'll point to what's going on in China. Russia just inked an agreement with China to become China will become Russia's biggest importer of their natural gas, bigger than Germany, which is, I think it's about 38% of Chinese natural gas needs are going to come out of Russia now.
Right.
China and Russia have now partnered in oil firms, in oil fields. Russia has taken China, who would be the decider, in my opinion, who would win a third world war, and has basically turned them into an economic ally. I didn't think this would happen this soon because China holds so much of our debt. I thought China would stay on the side of the United States or at minimum stay out of the fighting. But I don't see that now because obviously Putin has said the magic words and the Chinese see bigger profits by going with the Russians than they do holding our worthless debt that we make worth less every day by how much money we print.
Weigh in on that, Tim.
Well, yeah, I think you're right on to everything here, but it's very interesting. People don't realize how trade goes on between nations that are supposedly at war with each other. I remember the shock that occurred when one of the heads of the De Beers Diamond Group showed up in Moscow during the Cold War. And, of course, they were negotiating on diamonds and the diamond market. And I also recall that people didn't realize that Soviet Union had a warehouse at Geneva Airport in which they maintained a very, very large supply of gold that they could release onto the market as the prices dictated. And so they effectively controlled the flow because the Soviet Union and now Russia is one of the world's biggest gold producers. The other thing that they were doing was so they controlled the supply, but they also controlled the demand. Every time they wanted the price to go up, they simply instigated unrest in some part of the world. And you see that, even with the Ukraine, the stock market responded almost instantly. Well, the Soviet Union knew they could do that by just stirring up trouble in some place and knowing that that would push the gold price up, and then immediately they would release gold from this warehouse in Geneva. So the degree to which these things are being controlled, that people have no idea what's going on, it's been around for a long time. Just another way to illustrate it, they were still shipping iron ore out of Norway into Britain even after the Nazis had invaded. People have to understand this transcends all of the, on the surface, political stories that people are being told.
Well, Tim, you were in the Navy and you were in the Cuban crisis, and Dave, your father's military. I mean, when you think of how much America's changed just in the last couple of years, but the last decade, when you step back and take a macro view, Dave, what are your thoughts of everything going on right now? You know, the trail of dead bankers, the globally orchestrated meltdown, the Putin shuck and jive. I mean, where do we start really with all this, Dave? For people, especially the shoulder-shrugging Americans, my God, our forefathers would be shooting by now, but America remains in a trance while Rome burns around us.
It's not enough to start a war, in my opinion, and I'm not a violent person, but I'm just speaking from the lens of history, not from the personal desires of Dave Hodges. But Putin is setting himself up to basically tear down NATO, because if Putin says to Germany, who they supply 37% of their natural gas, 27% to Italy, 23% to France. If they say to these NATO partners, you're going to take the euro, and we also want some political concessions now too. If you want to heat your homes at night and not have major disruption, then NATO is going to be weakened. And right now, NATO really serves to benefit the United States in its central banking policies. It doesn't really benefit Europe as much as it does us over here with the Federal Reserve. I see NATO really disintegrating under what Putin's doing. Putin is going to roll his tanks into Ukraine. He's going to control that gas. He's making noises about Eastern Europe. Heck, Poland's even mobilizing their troops right now. I mean, this is World War II in many ways all over again. And then you got the Chinese trump card sitting in the background. But here's the thing about Putin. Putin is not a man that does not have restrictions on him. And this is where we could say, first of all, Obama's getting shut out. The Federal Reserve is getting shut out. They're losing badly. But we have 72 submarines that have nuclear weapons on them. Yeah. The Russians do not have the technological capability to track all of them and destroy all of them. Putin has to decide if he likes radioactive vodka, because this is what it's going to come down to if he keeps pushing. Yeah, it will, wouldn't it?
Isn't that a sobering thought, what you just said, though?
Well, the Federal Reserve is not going to take this lying down. I mean, you know, Rockefeller might cross both sides of the ocean and play the BIS versus the Federal Reserve. But I'll tell you, a lot of these Federal Reserve investors here in this country and some of our foreign investors, they're not going to take the dollar going down the tubes at a time of someone else's choosing. They'll take it down when it's convenient to take it down to merge it into a global currency. And if Putin's going to force the hand of this, Putin's going to get attacked.
Right, and he is the main driving force in making all this a reality, because if the banking cartel, like you said, is going to realize its dream of their new world order, Russia, China, and the U.S. economies must really be stomped out, really, because out of the
chaos... Third World War would have accomplished that now, wouldn't it?
Yeah. I think that support of what Dave is saying is Prime Minister Cameron of Britain urging Europe to develop fracking, to become independent of that Russian control of their energy supplies. But I also remind people that when Russia, this whole thing started with the Ukraine arguing against Russian control, and they simply jacked up the price of natural gas to the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians said, well, we're not going to pay that. And they said, fine, then we'll shut it off. And so there was pure resource blackmail has already gone on in that situation. So they won't hesitate to do that again. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But just a wider picture here, David. As you know, the British Empire, its power was its navy. It controlled the world through its navy. And so we were sea power. And Mahan wrote all the history of sea power. But then, starting about 1904, it shifted to land power. And Mackinder's heartland theory that you control the world by controlling land masses, particularly the Moscow plain. But by the end of the Cold War, it was back to sea power again. And you mentioned the submarines, and you know the strength of the intercontinental ballistic missile submarines that the U.S. had. What has gone by very quietly, very few people have paid any attention to this, is China now has 70 nuclear submarines. How has that slipped by without major attention? Of course, the capacity of these nuclear submarines, and I was in anti-submarine warfare for 5 years, so I know they're virtually undetectable. And I see us going back to that. And I think your comments about the submarine forces is very, very important here.
Well, it is neglect on our part that we let the Chinese progress to the point that we did. We have the intelligence to know what they were doing, certainly with our surveillance capabilities, and we had economic holds on them, certainly going back 5-10 years ago, that we could have exerted to stop them from being a proliferator of nuclear submarine warfare technology. But they're right there. They're a major player. Now, my military sources tell me their subs are not of the same class as our subs, and our subs are better than their subs, and their subs could be more detectable than our subs. But I said, well, what does that mean in terms of stopping a submarine attack? And they said, nothing. We'll still get hit.
I find it interesting that China's become the largest trading nation. The globalists have really put their plan into motion decades ago. And see, China was kind of like this little hidden dragon, crouching tiger, and they've systematically stripped. Just amazing what we've allowed happen in the last even 5 years. Creeping up, buying boatloads of gold, as these telling us. It's just amazing, Dave. That's a really astute point.
Well, the BRIC nations really think they can defeat the central banks as a whole, and their push towards gold really exemplifies that. I mean, China, India, and Russia have all entered into mutual trade agreements with each other where they're no longer trading using the dollar. They're using gold or their own national currency. See, China has two currencies. They have a national currency and a foreign currency, or a domestic currency and a foreign currency. And we're seeing more of the world moving towards that kind of thinking. Even if they don't have two currencies, they're using gold like a domestic currency. And the whole goal here is to undermine the petrodollar. Bretton Woods agreement from 1944 is on its death throes.
Cannot believe that Congress has had a chance to deal with some of the worst decisions, especially financially, ever made. I think about the approval of the TARP, certainly at the end of the Bush administration, where they basically handed over to, as you know, Dave, first under Hank Paulson, putting unlimited funds into bailing out any type of financial derivative. I mean, this international banking cartel can essentially shut down any economy. Like, how does Congress, though, Dave, willfully go along with the destruction of a country?
I did a lot of work with a Canadian political commentator and author by the name of Peter C. Newman, and he told me one day that there are always two types of politicians. There are those that say, I've got some ideas that can help the country, and then there are those that say, I've got some ideas that can help myself. And the only thing that changes through time is the dominance of one group or the other. Right now, I would suggest you've got almost totally those that are in there that can help myself. I mean, here in Alberta, we had a premier of the province who was her expense account, wasting money, and so on. Her whole party were pleading for her to get out. They didn't know how to get rid of her. And then all of a sudden, surprise to everybody, she said no, she wasn't stepping down. She hadn't done anything wrong. And then all of a sudden, she announced, I'm resigning as of Sunday. That was I think it was a Thursday. Well, guess what? That was 4 days after she became eligible for full pension. And you look at this and you say, what is going on here? And, of course, people get into politics because they see the financial and personal opportunities in it, and that's what's dominating right now. But if I can flip back, Sheila, China, one of the things when we talk about geopolitics, one of the mistakes that the world has made is, and it was Saul Cohen who wrote a book called Geopolitics in a Divided World, and it influenced John Kennedy greatly. But he classified nations as inward and outward-looking nations, so that nations like Britain were outward-looking, the U.S. was outward-looking. China was defined as an inward-looking nation, and the argument that it called itself the Middle Kingdom because it was at the center of the world. And China has never had a history of colonial expansion. In fact, the book, I think what the title 1421, I believe it was about the only time in history when a fleet set out from China to look at other countries around the world. So the attitude was that, China's not going to have colonial ambitions or imperial ambitions, and of course that's changing very, very dramatically and obviously. But the other thing I wanted to comment was that Obama got into power because he didn't say this openly, but it was there in his writings and so on, that he saw the U.S. as an imperial power and had to be pulled back and reduced in its influence and its dominance and dictating to the world how to live and how to behave. Well, guess what? The other day, Putin made a speech in Moscow where he said the Americans have bullied people and dictated and dominated, and it's time to come to an end. I mean, it was a speech that Obama could have made. And I said, well, what the heck is going on here? Are people not realizing what's being said? And so all of these things that are going on that are influencing what's happening in the world.
Well, Obama and Putin are effectively playing for the same side, whether they realize it or not.
Exactly.
Just in articles I've written, Obama was born to communists. He was raised by communists. Communists launched his political career, and I'm speaking primarily of Bernardine Dohrn and Bill Ayers. They actually had a party for him to launch his state senatorial campaign. Weatherman Underground source Larry Grathwohl, former FBI investigator. Joe Arpaio has that information here in Phoenix. He used it against Obama when he came after him for the dreaded SB 1070 immigration bill. And he went and did some research on Obama, and it parallels exactly what Larry Grathwohl and Joel Gilbert were saying. Obama is a plant, and he scares the heck out of me. We have competing interests in this country. See, a lot of people think everyone on the Federal Reserve is on the same side and the president's on the same side as the Federal Reserve. And I'm telling you, oh, no, they're not. I believe Obama really is beholden to the Bank of International Settlement. Everything he has done as president has served to undermine the middle class in this country. In fact, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but there is a martial law drill that started today, or DHS. Have you guys heard about this?
Funny what you're not being told on the 6 o'clock news, though, Dave, isn't it?
Yeah, it's fascinating what we're seeing going on here. The drill is set up initially as an earthquake happens in Alaska, and then there's a tsunami, and we have to have nationwide martial law. Well, that's nonsense on its face, because when we had that horrific earthquake in 1964 in Alaska, we didn't see the need for nationwide martial law. Don't need it now. Even in the drill, it makes no sense. But then they morphed the drill into a cyber security drill, like somehow a cyber terrorist has to sit around and wait for an earthquake to strike Alaska before they could attack our infrastructure with the computers. And then what are they going after? Not the cyber group, okay? They're going after the government officials who might be sympathetic to the cyber group. The group was called, I think they named the group in the document, Free Americans Against Socialist Tyranny, is what they gave this domestic terrorist group name for the purpose of their drill. But they're looking at getting people in the military who are sympathetic. Even their information analysts are coming under watch. And basically what it is, it's a see something, say something for the guardians of this country. We're seeing the possibility here, I think, of setting up a purge. And it's almost like what Hitler did when he killed the brown shirts after he took over, and he installed the Gestapo as the main enforcement. This is what I see this drill as. This drill is purging not just our military, as we've seen 260 fired generals, but we're also now seeing intelligence analysts. We're seeing people who are veterans and people who are in intelligence agencies who are going to be purged as a result of this drill. It's a total changing of the guard. We are Nazifying America through this drill.
Yeah, and of course you could add to that the fact that 9 of the nuclear-powered aircraft carriers have been docked in Norfolk, Virginia, along with the firing of all of those generals and admirals and so on. And it's almost as if they're completely taking away the strength of the American military. They're responsible to the commander-in-chief, but if the commander-in-chief is developing his own police force, is there going to be a battle between them? What's going to happen?
Well, the fact that you've got a purge going on speaks to that. the fact that you have 260-plus generals fired, a lot of them in the nuclear industry. Obama still, from my sources, can't get a hold of control of the nuclear submarines. He still doesn't have control of our entire nuclear arsenal. And it seems like no matter how many generals he fires, he's not making headway in that area. He's trying to grab the military, in my opinion, Obama is, so we will lose. We will lose a coming conflict. And, Tim, think about this for a second. If you had to negate one of two forces to really weaken America to where we could lose a third world war, to me that would be the carrier task forces.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I guess, if all this happens, I guess we're going to find out quickly why DHS purchased their 2.2 billion rounds of ammo and their 2,700 armored personnel carriers, aren't we?
Mm-hmm. Well, FM 3940, and I referenced it once again on my website today in my latest article. It is FEMA concentration camps, for a lack of a better term, the slang term, set up by Obama from leaked documents to house people who have been declared to be non-citizens. Now, think about the NDAA. You're declared to be an enemy combatant. They can snatch you off the street. You have no rights. You're put into camps. Well, we now know those camps are real. And if you dig deeper into the document, guess who's going to be maintaining these camps after training? Foreign national soldiers.
Of course.
Yeah.
Springboard into your article last year on the foreign troops on American soil, Dave.
Boy, guys, of all the things I take criticism for, when I bring up foreign troops, the rabid people come out of the woodwork and attack me. Oh, there's no Russians or Chinese waiting to do anything. And if that's true, why do I have two ex-generals who were fired by Obama who tell me that the Chinese have been promised the inland ports that hover over our underground natural resources when Russia devastates this country? And why is it that they acknowledge the existence of these FEMA-type camps that I alluded to today with documentation to the government document? And then you've got ex-CIA agent Jim Garrow who's saying exactly the same things as my military sources.
Yeah,
and he's saying them publicly.
Yeah, and of course the idea that there aren't foreign troops is the same thing as going on in Ukraine now, where they say, oh no, there's no Russian troops. You said we got no Russian troops there because they're there with all the insignia removed and in uniforms that are identical to those worn by the Ukrainian army.
Yeah, well, Ukraine situation in Crimea, boy, that's so interesting to me. Yeah. You look at what the Russians have done there. I get people that they write to me, and God love them, they're well-intentioned, but they just don't get it, and the media is not explaining it. When Crimea was run over by Russia, that would be the same as if Mexico took over Texas. Yep. Crimea belongs to Ukraine legally. The Russians had a right to maintain their naval forces there, period. But you look at what happened in Crimea. Russia had the right to maintain their naval forces there by treaty and by agreement.
By treaty,
they didn't have the right to occupy government buildings, seize airports, and block roads, and that's what they've done. They've committed an act of war.
Yeah, but of course, for the Russians, that access to the world, and Sheila and I have talked about this on a couple of occasions, but Sevastopol was one. They were also in Alexandria. That's why they cooperated with Egypt, and also, of course, Syria with Aleppo port there. Yes. And it's one of the bizarre geopolitical situations that here's the largest country on earth with very little usable coastline. They certainly feel entrapped, and then of course they were entrapped by the creation of NATO and MITO and CENTO and CETO, and Sheila and I have talked about that. But people don't realize, and that's also why the Russians were in Afghanistan, was, of course, to get access out of their southern boundary to the oceans of the world. And so that brings us back to the build-up of fleets at the end of the Cold War and back to sea power again. And I think that's where they're going with all of this as well.
Well, I think you're right, and this is why they're partnering with China so strongly, too.
Yeah.
Because vicariously they can work through Chinese ports. If they can control Chinese energy, they can get concessions.
Dave, I wanted to actually get you to weigh in on two things. Our audience is just inundating us in the chat room with questions for you, of course. And Dave, you've got a huge following. Absolutely love the fact that you're not afraid to go after the big dogs, and we really admire you for that. And of course, you've been a good friend of the Weekend Vigilante. We love your show. I want you to talk about what's coming up on Sunday, but weigh in on two things, Dave. What's your thoughts of this trail of dead bankers piling up here?
Well, as I started to follow this last year, I came across two trails. One was we've got disaffected ex-Navy SEALs who blame the fate of other dead Navy SEALs on banker policies and so forth, and they're exacting revenge. Army Rangers, ex-Army Rangers are part of this too. I believe it was Steve Quayle, but don't quote me. He has information to that effect. I know Jim Garrow has information to that effect, as well as some of my sources. But then I began to see bankers dying that didn't seem to have a real connection to some of these events that would lead to revenge motives from these paramilitary groups. And I start to see this as more of a kind of a mafia-type hit, closing the ranks to prevent prosecution if something goes south, to obscure facts and details from wrongdoing. And I'm speaking about protecting people like Jamie Dimon. There, I said it, it's out in the open.
Oh, good old Jamie Dimon.
What's the role of George Soros in all of this? Because he's taken after the banks just recently. He's turned on the bankers. Is this part of the same thing, or is he just simply a rogue agent?
Well, he's much more than a rogue agent. He is an agent provocateur for the Bank of International Settlement. He is in my opinion, he's the go-between between Basel, Switzerland, and the central banks of the world. And this is why he can get central banks to manipulate currency exchange rates and so forth, get the militaries to rise up. He was a big player in the Libyan situation. He's a provocateur. But his loyalties lie with the head of banking and economics on this planet. He's not really tied into any one central bank.
Do you find it interesting? Forex is essentially, think about it, it's a global manipulation of all funds. And yet I just find it interesting that when you really look, this Forex division, the multi-trillion-dollar market trading currencies, I mean, look at the Argentina peso. We saw that a couple of months ago. These guys have the ability to front-run those trades, making billions of dollars, and every one of these banksters, as Doug Hagman and I were talking about not long ago, seems to be tied in with Forex. So also just another interesting little connection there.
Well, I'm going to tell you something I've never talked about publicly. I had a chance to do a little bit of work, and believe me, I didn't know what I was into. I thought I was just being a nice PR guy. It goes back to the 90s, and I saw firsthand how the World Finance Group does what they call an arbitrage. Now, arbitrages can mean different things in different scenarios, but let me tell you what I observed. For the sum price of $65 million, you or your group could be involved in a joint investment venture where you throw money into one currency, in other words, otherwise to manipulate the price of another currency. And they'd get on a 24-hour clock, and they would know what something would open at from the close, and they would manipulate the price of that currency, and based on their investment, their $65 million would grow into maybe as much as $500 million. And I've seen them play this game as they circle the globe and walk away by devastating economies. And, of course, it always looks like it's a stock market collapse or some other such thing. But what they've done is manipulate currencies to fatten their own pockets. And I'm talking individual players, individual people. And I'm talking about the George Soros and so forth.
Yeah.
That was LIBOR too, though, did we not?
Well, that's very similar. It's interesting you picked up on that. That's extremely similar in that LIBOR benefited individuals, not necessarily a bank or necessarily a country.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Of course, they're under investigation, but of course nothing ever happens to these crooked
Oh,
bankers.
yeah. Well, I had to go in, and I'll just lay this out here because I was such a small-time player, and I didn't really understand what I was seeing until the end. But I went in and I gave presentations on why a bank should want to capitulate to a bigger interest. And I did this over 20 years ago, and I did it for a period of 2.5 years. And there were 10 of us here in America, at least that I knew about, that were called on to do it. And we were just brought in because of our presentation skills. Plain and simple, end of story. Didn't really have to have any special skills. And I worked through the Shearson Lehman House at that time. And it was simply a part-time venture, but it paid nice, and it paid off my grad school and all that nice stuff. And I didn't really know what I was into. I had no idea what I was into. Now, I had a 20-year non-disclosure agreement, which recently expired, so now I'm free to talk about this. And I have seen firsthand how this is done because I saw how a guy who owned banks in France was brought in, and they said, we can make more money for you than you can imagine. All you got to do is capitulate to the EU, and he did it. I saw another guy in France, and this is really what got me out of the business. his name was Charcot. He was a big player in French banking, and I can't remember how many banks he had, but let's say 4 or 5, and he wouldn't capitulate. He wouldn't sell out his interest. Well, they found he and his family dead, strangled with barbed wire at their French Riviera home. And that was really when I talked to my friend Sherry, who was working out of Portland. I said, Sherry, do you think this is related? And she goes, I don't see how it isn't. We politely backed out.
Yeah.
And we had to sign a non-disclosure agreement because I wanted nothing to do with that kind of foul play. But we're talking heads of state were involved in this.
Dave, I recall a story that there were 17 different world leaders, granted small countries, who blamed Soros for the collapse of their economies and wanted him reined in, but of course nothing ever happened about it. So that information was out there, what Soros was doing. Yeah, I think he's truly evil, and especially when you look at his beginnings in Hungary during the war, it's really frightening.
Well, Soros, his name was not unknown to me 20 years ago. Yeah. I'll just say it that way.
Yeah, okay.
Interesting.
This is why I can speak with real confidence about whose interests he really serves.
Yeah.
He's not tied into the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is nothing but a tool for the bankers from Basel. That's it. They're an employee.
Interesting. Wow. Well, and let's get your thoughts on, of course, the good old topic of discussion in the last couple of weeks, the plane. Dave, what are your thoughts on this flight?
Oh, boy, oh, boy, oh, boy. This is where family history plays a nice role. My dad, and I've mentioned him recently now since, my mother's death, I had to be really careful of talking about my dad's work, that he revealed a lot of what he did to me, and this will tie into the plane coming through the back door. But my dad told me some things in his final days when he was terminal, and he also said you can never really release this publicly or talk about it publicly because your mom will get my Navy pension from being a captain and on and on and on. So, okay, I agree to that, Dad, and tell me everything you know. I only revealed it to 3 people, what my dad told me, and this will come right into the situation with this plane. I had a meeting that was set up by Bill Pollock, ex-CIA guy, who's now the late Bill Pollock. He died about 7 years ago. And I met with Jim Mars at the Phoenix airport, and I knew Jim had a lot of this information from reading some of his stuff. And people thought that Jim and I should get together and share information, which we did. Jim respected my privacy. He just commented on this on his Facebook recently, too. Vance Davis, ex-NSA, and, of course, Bill Pollock, as I just mentioned. Bill Pollock was the late husband of my news director. Well, here's where this goes to. My dad was involved in really, really high-tech stuff at the end of his Navy career in the late 50s. He was on board the Roosevelt carrier, the first ship to get nuclear weapons in the Navy, and he was in charge of rewiring the Combat Information Center. So, I mean, we're talking the highest level of military secrecy at that time. He was retired from the Navy 6 months early before his departure date, but they gave him full retirement. And that's because they wanted to put him to work in Martin Marietta in Littleton, Colorado, out there in Coal Creek Canyon. And he was working with, at this plant now called Lockheed Martin, he was working with captured ex-German scientists and one Russian. And I even met some of these people as a small child. They would even trot through the house, and we spoke German in the house because my dad's family's from Germany, and I was somewhat fluent in German at the time. I mean, I remember this well. I mean, even though I was pre-writing, preschool, I remember these guys coming through the house. And my dad told me in his revelation days that we had technology that has manifested itself into a secret space program, like we have deep space platforms, for example, that have unbelievable surveillance capabilities. He said nothing moves on this planet without us knowing about it. He said that to me in 1985. 1985. We're talking almost 30 years. That Malaysian plane was never missing. We have technology, according to my father, and other people like Vance Davis has validated this, that's 100 to 300 years ahead of what the American public knows about.
Sure.
That plane is not missing. That plane is exactly where it's supposed to be by whoever put that plane where they wanted it to be.
Everything you know and all the intel you get, what do you think the bigger piece of this puzzle is, just on a gut level?
I tell you what, I only talk about really what I think I can prove and what I know.
Of course.
And that's because of my academic background. I mean, I primarily have taught research, statistics, and psychology classes, a good portion of my adult life. And I'm guided, by those principles. But I'm going to step outside my comfort zone for a second, tell you what my father told me. And Vance Davis really validated a lot of this, too. I asked my dad, I said, how did the Germans get so advanced? because he told me about some of the craft they had. We had vertical takeoff craft in the 60s as a result of what the Germans had revealed to us. We took off their drawing boards, we reverse engineered it and operationalized it. And my father said, although I do not know because I do not have access to the information, I do not see how we do not have a secret space program. And I said, well, how did the Germans get so darn advanced? And he says, I have no idea, but I'll tell you what they tell me. He said that two of the Germans said that they had direct contact with alien beings who were giving them the technology, but then the aliens got wet feet or whatever, decided they didn't want the Germans to have it, and they backed out, and the stuff never got fully developed. Now, listen, you ask me, is there alien life? I'll say statistically and probably, yeah, out there in the universe, the odds favor it does exist. Is it here on Earth? I have no idea. I have no proof of that. I don't really have an opinion. My dad didn't have an opinion either, but he said, I don't know if the Germans were right. He said that they believed they were right. They believed this technology came from something beyond. And this is what attracted Jim Mars to my dad's work, because Jim Mars wrote about the Nazi bell, which is supposedly of alien origin.
Yeah. And
that's what Jim wrote in his book. So that was the reason Jim Mars, when he knew from Bill Pollack what I knew, why he wanted to speak with me. So, I don't know, guys. I mean, I'm a guy that will talk about what I can prove and what I can demonstrate. I can't prove and demonstrate that. So where is this going? There is something guiding movement on this earth, and I'll speak very almost metaphorically here. We've got the specter of transhumanism, which is threatening to change human beings as the way God created us. It's a horrific turn of events, and we shouldn't be wasting one dime on this satanic technology. So certainly there are people trying to morph human beings into what we are not. Vance Davis, ex-NSA, said they were taught in their training that the evil forces out there want to control the soul, and if they can't control the soul, they want to change humanity. He said that's what underlies transhumanism. Then you have the planet being terraformed. You have the Gulf oil spill and the changing of climate from that and all the stuff that spills off of that. And then you have almost an extinction-level event in Fukushima. Then you have GMOs and the chemtrails that basically blotting out almost 20% of our sunlight now and changing agricultural patterns and causing famines. What is going on this planet that's causing some group of people to want to transform humans and transform the Earth? Almost terraform the Earth.
When you really step back and look at it like that, that's a complete sci-fi come to life, really.
One of the things that I've said for a long, long time is that the two issues of the 21st century, one is going to be water, because they'll use that as a vehicle for one world government, the same way they tried it with climate change. But the other is magnetism. I know that magnetism, there's a guy in England by the name of Piers Corbin who's an astrophysicist. He's been making 85-90% accurate weather forecasts, and in fact has a business doing weather forecasts. So you've got to be correct, otherwise you're not going to sell. And his name came up in the British Parliament, where they said, look, get rid of the UK Weather Office and just hire this guy because he knows what's going on. I know that Piers is using solar magnetism and earth magnetism in terms of getting accurate forecasts. And when you think about these devices implanted and the way that magnetism affects plant growth, cell growth, everything else, I think this is going to be a critical issue in the 21st century.
Well, then we get into the technology. Yep. I think you're almost bordering on, Tim, talking about what's commonly called hyperdimensional physics, which is different than Newtonian physics. Is that where you're going?
Yep.
Well, that's something my dad did know about, because he saw the proof in the work that he was gleaning from these German scientists. And the way he explained it to me, he goes back to Tesla, but he said Tesla wasn't alone. He said Tesla had hyperdimensional physics capabilities where you're basically using energy from other dimensions, much like what Michio Kaku talks about with, superstring theory. And the U.S. Navy got a hold of it after the globalist bankers shunned Tesla because he could have delivered free energy. So the Navy got a hold of this technology and started working on it, and then pretty soon it ended up in the globalist community that they control this technology. And some people think, well, if it's not aliens that gave the Germans the technology that they gave to us, it could have been Tesla technology that was rerouted to the Germans by some New World Order force that wanted to create, the conflict U.S. versus Germany, and this is the way they were arming the Germans to make them be able to stand up to us. That's an alternative hypothesis. But the one thing I do know is this. American universities coming out of World War II, following the death of Tesla, went the Newtonian physics route when they should have gone the hyperdimensional physics route. Because if we ever travel in space to vast distances, we will have to travel multidimensionally, kind of like pulling up the carpet and going through the hole in the rug. This is the way that we'd have to travel, hyperdimensionally. If you go Newtonian physics, you'll never get anywhere much beyond the planet Mars. So we should have gone this route, and we didn't. And it's withheld technology. And this is what my father had a hand in. And this is also some of what exists right now today out in outer space on these deep space platforms that are 24,000 miles orbiting the Earth.
Yeah, I think a good example of that for me in a very simplistic way was the inability to distinguish between conventional warfare and nuclear warfare. And when the cruise missile came along with that sort of very, very rigid, singular view of things, they couldn't accommodate it. And so the difference in physics, as you're saying, is somewhat similar to that. But you're educated and you only have a singular view of things. It severely limits where you can go and what you can do. And I couldn't agree with you more.
Well, when you look at splitting the atom, which is supposed to be the centerpiece of a nuclear explosion, what splitting the atom does not explain is where does the energy come from that creates such a horrific explosion? Well, hyperdimensional physics explains it perfectly. It comes from another dimension. You're pulling in an energy source from outside your three-dimensional universe.
Yeah. Well, I think this is part of the reason that Hawkins abandoned his theory about the black hole.
Yeah, that's a can of worms there, Tim.
Exactly.
Ask yourself the question, what were they doing in CERN with regard to black hole experimentation?
Oh, and I know what was going on at CERN and the degree to which that place was political, because one of the things that went on in the climate field was that we knew that temperature on Earth varied with sunspot activity, but we didn't know what the mechanism was. And then a guy by the name of Svensmark realized that what was happening was, or the mechanism was that as the cosmic radiation from space entered the Earth's atmosphere, it created low-level cloud. It created what we call condensation nuclei. Now, we knew there was more cloud than there was nuclei, and suddenly this Svensmark explanation provided it. So as the amount of cosmic radiation reaching the Earth was determined by the magnetic field of the sun. That varied with activity in the sun, which was also manifest in number of sunspots. So it wasn't the sunspots themselves that was affecting the temperature on Earth, but it was all related to variations in magnetic strength of the sun and then determining low cloud cover on the Earth, which, of course, has a direct effect upon temperature. But the reason I'm raising this is because the final proof that this cosmic radiation was creating condensation nuclei and low cloud cover had to be determined at CERN. And they sat on it for, almost a year. And then when they did come out with it, it was determined that they already knew the answer, but the head of CERN had told them that it was political dynamite to say anything about it, but somebody leaked it. So I know the political machinations that have gone on.
One of the questions I just got emailed me, Dave, is what your thoughts are in this Turkish government officials being caught red-handed in this leaked audio tape planning this false flag attack. It says a pretext to invade Syria, like Dave Hodges' take on the Prime Minister blocking YouTube. Any thoughts on that, Dave?
I will tell you this. I called for this 2 weeks ago. I said when Ukraine falls under Putin and Putin starts to squeeze Europe with gas, we will invade Syria because we need to somehow eradicate one of these two zones to keep the petrodollar as the source of buying energy. Predict World War III will start in Syria. That's my prediction.
So interesting. Well, Dave, I kept you a half an hour longer than we were supposed to go, and I really appreciate you coming on the show. Give out your website. Of course, most people have it, but give it out again. And, Dave, tell us what you've got coming up on Sunday.
Well, the website is www.thecommonsenseshow.com, and this Sunday we have ex-CI agent Dr. Jim Garrow. And Jim is on with an agenda he's not totally revealed to me yet, and that means big stuff is going to get talked about.
Wow. Well, I'll be listening to that one, Dave. Dave, again, you're a good friend of the program. I'm glad you came on today.
Thanks for having me on, guys.